It's that time of the year once again. All 10 of the 2024 Formula 1 cars have been revealed. Some are good, some are bad, and some are just ugly. But what really counts in Formula 1 is making the car quick. So let's reflect on 2023 and break down what each team needs to have at the top of their to-do list coming into this year's testing to make sure they're moving in the right direction. Let's start off with Haas, and I think everybody realised that their key downfall last year was the fact that they worked their rear tyres way too much, which was frustrating because they had really good pace in qualifying, but couldn't keep the tyres working for long enough stints in the race to actually be competitive with the cars that they qualified around. But I think this links to a wider issue of the Haas team in that they need to find a way of developing through a season, because whenever they upgrade, it does feel like nothing really happens. Over the last few years, they've been able to start the season really well and then just stand still whilst others improve throughout the year, which means by the end of it, they're at the back of the pack again by a considerable margin. However, Gene Haas has said he won't be investing in the team until they improve, but they massively need investment to improve their resources to help find solutions to their problems. So unfortunately, I think Haas are just in a spiral of nothingness. I find it really difficult to discuss Stake Sauber with any kind of hope that they'll actually look to improve because, let's face it, at the moment they're just treading water and waiting for Audi to come in 2026. So there's no massive incentive to sort things out right now, which is a shame because I think they have a pretty good car concept on their hands, and last year they just lacked a little bit of consistency, especially with their ride height. They really struggled to find a balance where they could run the car low enough to generate downforce whilst also not wearing the plank too thin and getting disqualified, which we did see can happen. And all of that meant that the drivers didn't really have any confidence in the car in the corners because it didn't stick to the track in the way they wanted it to. But then you could also argue that neither of the drivers really seemed to be able to extract any pace from the car and put together eye-catching performances. Even if the car is tricky to drive, neither of them really caught fire last year. If they're serious about improving this year's car, they need to sort out the ride height issues. But if they're just waiting for 2026, I'd say the main thing to sort out is their driver lineup. After that, we have another team name disaster in Visa Cash App RB. I really don't think that's ever going to roll off the tongue, but the main thing I was going to say for this team moving into this season is to use more of the resources for being the sister team to Red Bull. But it seems like they're already doing that, as contentious as it may be. So I'm going to come up with another thing that I think they need to change. And the thing that came to mind for me straight away was I think they just need to choose a driver and really build the team around them so that they can bring back a little bit of identity to the team. For a while, it felt like they did this with Pierre Gasly, but we always knew he was going to move on eventually. And I just think that Daniel Ricciardo coming in at the end of the season and the car improving so much, in my opinion, wasn't a coincidence. I think the team is desperate for an experienced driver to really build this team around for a few seasons. But as a sister team, one, you're never really going to get that from the driver's perspective because your drivers will always be looking to move on to an actually competitive team, which, let's face it, this team isn't designed to be. And two, it is designed to bring in youth into the sport for Red Bull. So if you're Red Bull, you kind of want both of these seats to be almost constantly available if you need them, so that if there is a youngster that starts to improve or shows that they might be ready for Formula 1, you can slot them right in. And that's the problem that they've had. Liam Lawson looks set to be in Formula 1, but still can't get into this team. But if this team really does want to step forward and wants to become a viable midfield team once again, I think they need to try and convince Daniel Ricciardo to stay around for a while and almost be the face of this team and the driver that they build the whole car around, and then bring in a youngster next to him to develop under his tutelage. The problem they have is that you're not going to convince Daniel Ricciardo to stay if Red Bull come calling, because he is absolutely desperate to get back into that Red Bull seat. When it comes to Williams, I definitely think last year showed that they're moving in the right direction. The car before was very track specific, but last year it looked much more adaptable and was able to perform on most weekends in the hands of Alex Albon, which is why early this season, Williams have to have a focus on their second driver and really start to think about why is Logan Sargent there? Do they just need his finances? Their car launch was in the US, they are building a much bigger market there, so does that outweigh his performances if they don't improve come 2024? Because now, on top of that, there is so much speculation around Alex Albon. He's being linked to Mercedes, he's being linked to Red Bull, and if he chooses to move to another team, suddenly Williams could find themselves in a situation where they have to replace both drivers at once, which, whilst they're trying to continue their positive 2023 season into this year, could be a massive issue. So even though the driver market is crazy right now, Williams more than any other team need to have clarity and focus on their driver lineup for the beginning of this season. Whereas I would argue Alpine is kind of in the opposite situation to Williams. They have their drivers sorted. I think they'd be pretty happy to keep hold of Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon moving forwards, but the management group keeps changing key personnel within the team, so nobody really knows what direction they're trying to go in. They started the 2022 regulations well, and then they fell apart a little bit, and in my opinion, were way too quick to just give up on people and try and move on. So coming into this year, I think they need to decide on a management structure, decide on a trackside team so that they can come in, choose a philosophy based on that personnel, and give them a chance to actively settle within the team, to get to actually know their role and build on that. Because Paris wasn't built in a day and Alpine won't be fixed in a year. So they need to start looking longer term, because beyond just the team issues, they also need to continue to limit the damages caused by their power unit deficit and get their chassis in order, which is why I think Alpine are in the most complicated spot on the grid. And if you want to know the specifics in more detail, I made a whole video on it. That's how complicated I think it is right now at Alpine, and I'll link that at the end. Getting into the top half teams now, and Aston Martin's main focus seems quite obvious after last year. It has to be in-season development. Just knowing that if you're bringing an upgrade, it will actually be an upgrade would be amazing. You know you have an issue when Fernando Alonso, a driver that makes basically anything look quick, got to the point in Mexico where he just couldn't even get the car working despite starting the season with so many podiums. However, they now know what not to do. The direction that they lent in the second half of last season didn't work, and you know what, they took a step backwards and now they have a chance to step forwards again. They just need a clear plan for this season and need to be better at adapting to what they're seeing on track. It felt like they just kept leaning into the wrong philosophy, thinking that they'd eventually fix it, but that never really happened. And I think if they got that right, that will also help fix some of their other issues, in that it will help get the best from Lance Stroll, because when the car was in a good window, Lance wasn't actually too bad, and there is a driver in Lance Stroll that is passable, so I don't think he's the most pressing issue, which some people seem to think he is. Although with the Lewis Hamilton news, they also need to convince Fernando Alonso to stay, and if they can show that this project is still building towards something at Aston Martin, he's much more likely to stay at Aston than make another big switch in his career. Just outside of the big three is McLaren, and coming into this season, I am very excited to see what McLaren can do. I think it's fair to say in the second half of the 2023 season, they were quick, if inconsistent. The car was incredibly fast on high-speed circuits, and on its weekend, it was clear of the Ferrari and Mercedes cars by a considerable margin. But then when they had to change up the ride height and the aerodynamics for circuits with slower speed corners, the car was very unstable, and they just couldn't get the setup in the right spot, so they relied upon the drivers to make up for that in pure talent, which meant we saw mistakes creep in, particularly from Lando Norris in qualifying trim. Like, Mexico is the one that jumps to me straight away because of how quick he then was in the race. But this is tricky to sort out. The McLaren car does have weird DNA. We've heard this from almost every driver, and the complaints from every driver that's driven this McLaren car for years now. But with a new simulator and a new wind tunnel, that has to be the focus. Getting a better idea of how to set up this car before turning up to the track, so the drivers can just focus on getting the best pace out of the car that is there underneath the surface, rather than battling to figure out the car every single weekend. It feels like since the start of these regulations in 2022, Ferrari have had a good concept, and they've shown that the car is quick. Their one-lap pace is there in this Ferrari, because they did manage to pick up 7 pole positions in 2023. However, come race day, it felt like both drivers often struggled to tame the prancing horse underneath them. When they could, the peaks were high, but those peaks were not very consistent. Having said that, I do think the main thing they still need to address was the fact that they would have finished ahead of Mercedes comfortably had they not lost points to silly mistakes from the team and inconsistencies in reliability. Because outside of a manhole cover in Vegas, which they couldn't help, they also had reliability problems in Bahrain, Qatar, Brazil, along with a handful of botched strategies for each driver over the course of the 22 Grand Prix, which really doesn't help when your car is so peaky. So once again, it feels like we're looking at Ferrari's strategists and technical team to step up in 2024, so we can actually see the best of Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz on track, rather than seeing them in the garage. Moving on to Mercedes, which is a team that, let's not forget, wasted a year and a third on the zero pod. So at least that's no longer a problem. But then also, having made that change in Monaco, they couldn't develop the car that they wanted, so they had to focus on this season with a brand new car concept coming for 2024. And honestly, the best thing for Mercedes would be for this brand new car concept to be absolutely nothing like the old one, because they just couldn't control it. Look at the final stint of last season. They smashed up the cars in Qatar, but that was probably their best weekend. That led to Austin, where the car looked good, but it was illegal. They then looked okay in Mexico, only to have their worst race in years in Brazil. There was just no telling what Mercedes car was going to turn up. So the team coming together, hitting the reset button for a year, allowing everyone to reboot and focus on the future is a must right now, because they are miles off being competitive. However, with Lewis Hamilton deciding to activate a clause in his contract that allows him to escape from the team and move to Ferrari next year, the early signs of progress aren't hopeful, and that can't fill the team with confidence when your driver, instead of getting involved and hitting the reset button as well, has hit the eject button instead. Last but most certainly not least is Red Bull, and you're probably wondering, as I was, how exactly do you improve on a near perfect season? And the only thing that I could land on, apart from trying to convince Formula One higher-ups to remove Singapore from the calendar, was sorting out their qualifying, or more specifically, sorting out Sergio Perez's qualifying. Especially if the other teams are going to improve as much as we think they might, they need a stronger driver to perform in their second driver seat to help Max Verstappen on the odd occasion that he might actually be put under pressure. I mean, the Red Bull car has always been set up for races over qualifying. The team does compromise its tyre warm-up in qualifying for better race pace, and that does make sense. That's where you get the points. But Sergio Perez seems unable to adapt to this, and it was his qualifying rather than his race pace that really let him down. So I think they need to make sure that they try and address this issue for the Mexican and don't just rest on the fact that last year was so dominant that Sergio Perez won't really matter. I think they should give him the best opportunity to do as well as he can, because actually in the races, he was pretty good when he qualified where he should. It's just he didn't qualify where he should that often. Although saying that, I do feel like I'm picking a very minor issue when compared to every other team on the grid. But as always, I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on all of the teams in the comments down below. And actually, whilst you're down there, let me know your constructors' predictions for the 2024 season. And on top of that, shout out to James Lawrence Alcott and Tomo for the idea for this. Two absolute legends of the Formula One and football YouTube spaces. I'm sure you know both of those guys already. And if you enjoyed this video, as I mentioned before, I made a video on Alpine and why I think they're in a really tough situation in 2024. So click that link and I'll see you over there.